So it's been a couple days since I've been able to kind of like unwind from the Vince McMahon documentary. I watched 3 episodes on one day, 3 episodes on the next, and I recorded reviews right after seeing each episode. Now it's been a couple days and I've been able to kind of think through my thoughts a bit. So I want to give you kind of my final thoughts on the Vince documentary. The reason as to why this documentary was so meaningful for me. Not meaningful as far as like the content itself, but more so meaningful as far as the person being looked at. Is because I have been watching World Wrestling Entertainment, WWF, the Federation, since 1989. I was 5 years old. I was a little kid. And I have heard Vince McMahon's voice and seen Vince McMahon on television going back that far. I'm not sure if he's the first celebrity I ever knew, because obviously there was the wrestlers that were the real celebrities of the company, but it's a voice and a face that's always sort of been there. You know, going through it when he was a commentator, then becoming a television character, and then popping up sporadically from time to time. He was just always there, which is why it was so crazy to think that now we live in a world where he's out of the company. You know, he's out of the company that he basically elevated. And it's better for the company that he is gone. It's just a day that I don't think was ever. You couldn't think it would actually ever happen. You know what I mean? It's a guy. They even asked him on there. They even asked him, "Hey, are you ever going to retire?" And he made a comment about that, which I talked about in the review. That was kind of off-putting. About how he doesn't want to. I don't know why you would ever stop growing, and I commented on it already in my review. I have reviews for all 6 parts up on the channel. Now, my final thoughts are: episode 1 was interesting and had a couple sound bites that I won't forget. Episode 2 had even more sound bites that I won't forget. And then from episodes 3, 4, and 5, this came off like it really felt like it stopped being about Vince and went more to the things with WWE, the company, and the wrestling business, more than just about Vince McMahon, the person. And a lot of that part of the documentary, parts 3, 4, and 5, really more so 3 and 4, because 5 had some real interesting family stuff at the beginning and at the end of it. But definitely episodes 3 and 4 are topics that have been visited multiple times by multiple, documentaries. It's the greatest hits collection. But also, the thing that I think was most, I guess, irritating was the potential for more. For example, Jim Ross was not interviewed. Somebody who was beside Vince for a number of decades. Jim Ross is one guy. John Laurinaitis. This would have been recorded mostly before the Janelle Grant lawsuit was filed and John Laurinaitis was named in that. So they could have recorded something with him. Also, Vince's brother, Roger McMahon, before he died, they could have shot things there with him. There was a lot of pieces of the story missing, and it sort of, for those middle episodes felt like an A&E documentary. Like one of the WWE A&E documentaries they've been putting out lately, the biographies, and in some ways, even like some of the ones from the WWE Network or even the old school DVD era. WWE has historically put together some great documentaries. The Rise and Fall of ECW, The Spectacular Legacy of the AWA, the World Class one. They've put together some really great pieces throughout the years. The Brian Pillman, Eddie Guerrero pieces. But whenever it came to WWE ever being fair about their own, shady business practices, they rarely touched it. Whenever you'd hear them talk about the steroid trial or something like that, it was always played up from the defensive that, well, the federal government came after Vince McMahon. And in the documentary, they talked about what led to that, which was the Phil Mushnick New York Post story. Now, throughout most of my life, I have been, I guess, conditioned by wrestling to hate Phil Mushnick because Vince McMahon hated him. Because Jim Cornette would talk poorly about him. Jim Ross hated him. A lot of people in wrestling hated Phil Mushnick because he was writing hit pieces on not just wrestling, specifically WWE. Now, obviously, these are days when I was much younger, and I guess I drank the Kool-Aid because I didn't understand. Like, I always loved wrestling and I knew what it was, but I didn't understand about that seedy underbelly of wrestling throughout my childhood and throughout my teenage years. Like, I didn't know. You know, there was stories that had come out that I had heard of, and I knew there was a steroid trial, but when Vince was acquitted, it almost became a thing where, well, I guess he wasn't responsible. But in the documentary, there was a bit of a missed opportunity, and I wonder if maybe they did go there, but there was probably stuff left on the cutting room floor. Maybe they did, so I'm not going to give them too much flack for it. But my point is, the Phil Mushnick article that he wrote in the New York Post, "Sex, Lies, and Headlocks," I think it was called, or something like that, because there was a book that was called that. So I'm not sure if it was based on the story, but the story that he wrote in the New York Post was an article about how prior to the sex scandal with Mel Phillips, Vince McMahon had already been aware of Mel Phillips's strange, PDF file antics, let's just put it that way. And that Vince had actually gotten rid of Mel Phillips for a while because he suspected that and then brought him back. Now, I haven't read the New York Post article in quite some time. And I might be even listing the wrong article, so if I am, forgive me. But there was a lot of things that I thought were conspicuous by their absence. They could have asked Vince about that. Like, did you know anything about Mel Phillips? He may have lied. He probably would have lied. In fact, at the beginning of the documentary, he even says, "I can't tell you the whole story, but I'll give you something." Which he certainly did give us something. He gave us more than I think. What it is that this documentary showed us more about Vince and the family. Things that we had suspected, but now we see. The strange relationship between Vince and his dad. The weird stories of Vince's childhood with the incest and his mom. No details, although I'm not sure if I really want to hear details. It feels like whomever was around back then is no longer around, because remember, this man is in his 70s. He's turning 80 next year. So the adults of his childhood are all dead. So you can't really ask them. However, there was a book that was put out. I think the book was called Ringmaster. I think that's what it was called. And it was a book where many years ago they found out that a lot of the stories that Vince told when he was young were not true. About him being a street fighter and all that. Now, people say that Vince is tough, and I'm not saying he's not. It's just one of those things where this documentary could have really benefited from finding people from those days, but it feels like they're all gone. Like they're all gone. So who's to know how much of the stuff from his childhood was true, or stuff that he made up? Or the third option is the Hulk Hogan theorem, which is he lies so much that it's truth to him. And there is something like that. There is a way you can hypnotize your brain where if you create a lie and you say it enough times to yourself, years and years and years go by, and it just becomes your truth. You're almost implanting fake memories. It's a hypnotic technique that's been used by people to manipulate others. So, and to manipulate themselves. So, for all we know, I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions with that. And why Vince's brother was not even discussed, not even asked about. Linda wasn't even asked about it, or at least didn't make the final cut. That whole thing is a mystery. I thought that they wasted way too much time. I said it in my reviews for the individual episodes, but after seeing the full package, I thought they wasted too much time on stuff that wasn't about Vince. I understand going briefly about the company going public and what that meant. I understand going through some of the financial failures, the casino, WWF New York. I get that. And I understand covering some of the big events like WrestleMania 1 and WrestleMania 3. When they covered WrestleMania 2, the experiment from 3 arenas, they didn't even talk about how that was supposed to be Vince trying to one-up Jim Crockett because Starrcade was at 2 arenas. So there's that, but that's not a huge deal to me. I thought, however, that they spent way too much time on Rock and Hogan. You know, I'm not saying that wasn't a big match because it was, but to me, it wasn't a match that really changed the trajectory of the business. Like, the match was a dream match, no question, but it wasn't like WrestleMania 1 or WrestleMania 3. WrestleMania 1 and WrestleMania 3 are part of the WWF and Vince McMahon's origin story. You have to tell those stories. You could even have some fans say, well, WrestleMania 5 was the Mega Powers exploding. Vince's, people say that's his greatest storyline. And it probably was. Either that or him versus, Austin. But, they didn't even go into that. But they did go a little bit into WrestleMania 6 and 7, which I don't think either of those, yes, Vince was the head of the company, but you could have spent that time going into other things. I didn't need to hear about The Rock. Like, I know the story of The Rock coming in as Rocky Maivia and eventually being able to go heel and become himself. We know that story. That story's been told numerous times. Hell, even The Rock told that story on the Patrick Bet David podcast like last week. It might have been earlier this week. I forget. He was on there recently. And he told that story verbatim. That's more, if you're doing a documentary about Dwayne Johnson, then you talk about that. This is more about Vince. And they could have gone through the whole DX, Austin, Rock stuff faster. And focus more on Vince. Focus more on that. What about that Howard Stern interview where he said that, where Howard Stern asked him about the women that he had been with, how many women there were, and then Vince said, oh, if they had a skirt. That could have been brought up, especially when they were editing the documentary together after the 2022 Wall Street Journal situation. They could have put that as part of the narrative. Or they could have also talked about the story where there was a story where Linda basically said she was going to divorce Vince if Vince didn't stop cheating, and then he promised he never would again, and then he did it again. That was also never brought up. Now, is that too personal? Are they flying too close to the sun? Maybe. But this is a documentary about Vince McMahon, and the reality is he's too old and he's too stubborn to ever tell us the truth about anything at this point from now on. So I think he could have been challenged a bit better. And after thinking about it now and watching sort of parts 1 through 5 and then part 6, I almost want to tell people just watch part 6. Don't even bother with the first 5 parts. Because, not that they weren't interesting, because parts of them were, but part 6 is when you get into what people came to see. The Chris Benoit stuff. A little bit about the Succession story with Shane and Stephanie and Triple H. And a bit about, obviously, the Janelle Grant stuff at the very end of the documentary. They could have asked about those situations, how true they were. There was also a story in the Janelle Grant lawsuit that talked about that Vince and Linda were separated. And that's something that Meltzer confirmed, and there were others that confirmed it too, that Linda and Vince are still legally married, but they have not been, I guess, together for many, many years, maybe a decade. And I think the last time that Vince really showed himself around Linda in the public eye is when Linda was running for office many years ago in the I think it was the mid-2010s or the early 2010s. I don't remember the exact year. I wonder if Vince was asked about that. What he thought about his wife running for office. What he thought about that whole situation. Or did they not get to that? You could tell now, looking at the way things were, like I said, talking about parts 3, 4, and 5, or 2, 3, and 4, any of the middle ones, right? You could kind of tell that originally this documentary was going to be a fluff piece. This documentary was probably going to be not that different from the WWE fluff pieces. Maybe a little tiny bit closer to the edge. Maybe a bit closer to the truth, although not all the way there. And you could tell that what happened in 2022, then of course 2023 and 2024 affected the final product completely. Because it feels like for a time, and remember, the doc was supposed to come out years ago. This was supposed to come out 2022, 2021-ish. But when the Wall Street Journal scandal broke, you could tell that people at Netflix, I'm not sure if it was Bill Simmons, I don't know who, and he's not at Netflix, he's got his own thing, The Ringer. But I'm not sure which of the producers were like, well, we can't make this a fluff piece. We have to edit around this and sort of paint it as, you know, maybe he's a monster. But the documentary wasn't sure which way to paint it, as a monster or as a great man. You could certainly make the argument that at one point they could have gone the direction of, well, Vince was a victim because of what his stepfather did. I mean, Vince was once quoted as saying, and I quote, "I wish he were still alive so I could murder him myself." That's hatred, man. That's hatred. McMahon never let that go, dude. So it feels like they had so much of this documentary, you know, maybe almost finished, or they had, you know, several different cuts. And then when the stuff happened in 2022, 2023, 2024 with the scandal, they almost had to go back and kind of recut episode 1 a bit and maybe move some stuff around. Because what was telling was that part where Vince talked about the computers in his head, how his brain has like multiple computers, and he admitted that one of them is thinking about sex. So they're using images from WWF television, WWE footage of Vince with these divas and these women, and then they have sound bites of him pretty much telling us he's kind of a sex addict, along with the comment he made about the referee when he said, well, even if I did do it, statute of limitations is up on it. Like, why would you say something like that? That's like that's your ego speaking out of turn. That's when you say something you're not thinking. There was even a part in the documentary where they start talking about Sable, Rena Lesnar now, and somebody on the side of the like somebody who was one of Vince's handlers was saying in storyline. That was Paul Heyman. Which means that one of the people that was there with Vince was Paul Heyman. He probably had lawyers with him as well to make sure that he didn't incriminate himself. However, just by him saying what he said, well, statute of limitations, you know, that, and him saying he's always thinking about sex, you could easily infer, editing that together with the scandal, the Janelle Grant scandal. And when you look at the whole picture, it paints Vince as this guy who has a lot of strange sexual fantasies, and a guy who could have been the dude who committed these crimes, probably was the guy who committed these crimes. Again, he hasn't gone to court yet, but these things tie together. And it felt like when every time they would talk about The Rock or Austin, and it wasn't like really focused in on Vince and at least his reaction to these things, you know, it sort of took away from that. I remember hearing that this is supposed to be a 4-part documentary, wound up being 6 parts. And it definitely, you know, it affected me because, you know, I always wanted to like Vince. You know, even when he was a bad guy, he was so entertaining. When I was in high school, like I used to love Vince coming out because he was funny. Like, he was a funny guy, you know, and the past few years, obviously people probably didn't know how bad it really was. But even though I knew about these rumors of the past, I always thought, well, maybe they were just rumors, you know. But when you really look into it, like and this is of course me being younger. This is when I was a teenager, you know, young adult. But, you know, the more you look into Vince's past, this is a very troubled man. And a man who, and I'm not trying to make him the victim at all. There's some narcissism there. There is some very selfish, self-centered behavior. There's a lot of Vince being callous about things, especially when they showed the interview where he took no responsibility for the young deaths in wrestling. Not even a little bit. I mean, that schedule was made by your company. They got them all hooked on pills. Not even a little bit of guilt. That's not a good sign. While at the same time, they painted Shane McMahon as a guy like Vince who never got the validation from his father but always wanted it. And they also painted Shane as a guy who turned out to be a bit more normal than Vince, you know? He really did. Shane turned out to have more of a heart than his own father. At least that's the way it was portrayed. And he looked good in this documentary. I think that this shone a new, or shined a new light. I don't know if shone's even the right verb. Shined a new light on Shane. Ultimately, as a hardcore fan, a lot of time was wasted, on other things. And there was a lot of potential to ask deeper and better questions. How much would Vince really answer? And will there be a follow-up? Remember, the R. Kelly documentary had a follow-up. This Janelle Grant lawsuit is far from over. There's still an investigation going on right now from the feds. The story is not, this story is not finished yet. And there could be time to come back and do a new documentary. But if they do, will the parties all come back? And if so, Vince is not going to come back, I would assume. But will Netflix be okay with it, considering that by the time that this story, continues, Raw will have already been on Netflix? Because that's coming up in just 3 months. 3.5 months. Raw will be on Netflix. Is Netflix going to put a documentary out about a company that they are licensing? And the guy who, granted, he's not in the company anymore still. It almost felt like the timing of this was sort of like Netflix saying, okay, we can't wait anymore for this Janelle Grant thing to get resolved because it's going to take months and months and months because lawsuits are very slow. And we can't risk putting it out after WWE's already on our network. So let's just put it out now. It almost felt like they wanted to just get what they had out now and just forget about it, which is unfortunate because there's a lot of the story that we may never ever get the real story. Are we ever going to find out what really was going on with Vince's mom? Are we ever going to know how Vince's mom and dad met? Vince Sr. and his mom, how did they get together and why did they split up? What was the story behind that? How did Vince end up being with his mom the first, 16 or so years of his life, something like that? He didn't get to meet his dad till he was, 12? There's got to be a story there. That's not normal. That's not average family life, especially in those days. You got to remember the divorce rate might be high now, but back in the day, divorces were not that common. Not anywhere near the way they are now. I mean, nowadays, people aren't even getting married anymore because they know it might not work out. Back then, for there to be a divorce, something had to have happened. Something had to have hit the fan. We're not going to ever get that story. I mean, hell, I know. Look, my parents got together many, many years before I was born. Many years before I was born. And actually, my parents got together, split up, and then got back together again later on and then got married. So they had a breakup where they stopped being together for years and then reunited and got back together. It's a nice story, honestly. It's a very nice story. What's the story of Vince's parents? I want to know. I want to know. Did Vince Sr. ever talk about Jess McMahon? Did Vince Jr. ever meet Jess McMahon? I don't think he's ever talked about it. So it's just, it's now that I've been able to unwind, a lot of it was a waste of time for somebody like me, and this could end up just being a story that we just never find out. We just never know the truth. Because like I said, people from those days, most of them are no longer with us. Vince McMahon is the one that's still around of that whole circle in that area that we know of. And he's going to tell whatever story he wants to tell. So, for wrestling fans, you already know this. For people who aren't wrestling fans, it'll be an eye-opening look at some of the scandals in the company. And there's a lot more stuff they could have talked about, more granular stuff that I wish they would have gone into. But, hey, it's tough because you could do a 30-part documentary on Vince McMahon because there's so much. There is so much history going back to San Martino and all that stuff that, we'll never see it. This will be the Vince McMahon documentary that will be probably the most prolific until maybe after he dies, if people decide to start talking then. And even then, who knows? Because like I said, most are probably already dead. What did you think? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video.